the history of Lubavitch, of our generation, the Rebbe's generation, the seventh generation, there is a personality who was quite interesting, and I guess people who were involved in Shlichus 50 years ago and more, he was a very important person, and of course also less. His name was Dr. Velvel Green, Professor Velvel Green. Now, I never met Velvel Green. I met his son a few times, but I read some of his books, and of course we also see the videos that they have of his recollections of his involvement with the Rebbe. I would strongly encourage people should get a hold of his Svartim in English and read them, because they're, first of all, he's a good writer, he has a great sense of humor, very easy to read. And what he shares is very intimate and personal and living. You could relate to it very easily. He has a book in Hebrew, which is a crime, because the book is based on English letters and classes that he delivered in English, and the entire thing is in Hebrew. He lived at the end of his life in Be'er Sheva, where there is a university, and he would come into the Beis Chabad, to the Chabad house there, and give a class once a week on a letter that he had received from the Rebbe. The name of the book is Shalom Uvracha, Shalom Uvracha. And he would bring in a letter of the Rebbe, and he would read it with the students, and he would tell the story behind the letter. And in this book, you have these letters, the original letters of the Rebbe, facsimiles of the original letters of the Rebbe, pardon me, and then the Reka, the history around it, and it's incredibly enlightening and informative and educational. And of course, the strange hashgacha around this sefer is that literally a day before he passed away, he wrote the foreword to the book. It was almost like as if he had finished, and then he passed away the following day. Anyway, if you'll read his books, what I'm about to say is not from that book, it's from a different book that I read of his, a little pamphlet. I'm sorry, I don't remember the name. You learn about how he got involved with Yiddishkeit, not how he got involved with Lubavitch. It had a lot to do with everything to do with Rabbi Feller, Rabbi Moshe Feller from Minnesota, who came to the Twin Cities as the Rebbe's Shliach in whatever it was, Tafshin Chaf Aleph, 1961. Rabbi Feller was originally from there, and I guess I'll tell this story as an opener to the point that I want to share, that him and his wife, they were not Orthodox Jews, but they were very, very Jewish. They were very heavily involved in Zionism. They had very strong Yiddish culture, and they belonged to a very staunch member of the conservative congregation at that time. And they were involved in all kinds of Jewish things. So they had a book club of young Jewish intellectuals who would meet once a month. They would choose a book, and then they would discuss it the following month and choose another book. This was the way they did it. And they had chosen a book on the pogroms of 1648, 1649. I apologize that I don't remember the name of the author or the publishing house, because I didn't look up the story today, it's from memory. But they had chosen this book, and everybody read it. And of course it describes what we would call a shmad, where they didn't just murder Jews indiscriminately, they gave every single Jew the choice of the cross or the sword. And tens of thousands of Jews, in some cases every single man, woman, and child in the community, were Mekadesh Shem Shemayim Barabim, were Moshe Nefesh Kiddush Hashem, not to Rahman L'Islam B'mei Mirdas, which means to convert to another faith. So you have these modern American Jews who were very Jewish, but not particularly religious, Orthodox as it were, reading this book. And it had to be very intense, it had to be very emotional, it had to be very painful. And of course, the ultimate issue that they came away with was, would they do that? How would they react? And they sort of all agreed that they wouldn't be Meisei Nefesh al Kiddush Hashem. And then the discussion which followed was, are there such Jews alive today? Are the Jews alive today who be Mekadesh Shem Shemayim Barabim rather than convert to Christianity? And they agreed that there were no such Jews anymore. This was in the past. And then about a month later, or 2 months later, he met Rabbi Feller. And of course, there's the famous story with Rabbi Feller, how he came into his office. He wanted to get an appointment with him. And Velvel Green was a big Baltzdoker. And he gave, the way he writes it in his books, he would give $18 if someone came from out of town, a meshulach, $25 for a local. And remember, these were from Jews who came around raising money. In those days, a from Jew knocked on the home of a secular Jew. He didn't feel like he was an alien or a stranger. They helped him. There was it's a different world. It's 60 years ago. And non-religious Jews were much closer to traditional Jews culturally than they are today. They had parents who were from, or grandparents. It was the sense of distance that you feel from secular Jews today, because our lives are so disparate, wasn't the same that many years ago. So Rabbi Feller calls up and he asks for an appointment, and the secretary says he can come get an $18 check. Now in 1960 it was a lot of money. Rabbi Feller says, I'm not interested in the money, I want to meet the professor. So she goes into Professor Green and she says, the rabbi is on the phone and he wants to meet you, and I offered him $18 and he doesn't want to take it. So he says, offer him $25. So she gets back on the phone and she says to Rabbi Feller, that the professor of Evel Green doesn't have time to meet you, but you can come collect a check for $25. And he says, again, I don't want a check, I want to meet the professor. So she goes back again to Velvel Green, and she tells him that he doesn't want to take $25 checks. So he says, okay, tell him $36 final offer. And $36 was money. It was a lot of money. So she gets back on the phone and she tells Rabbi Feller that Velvel Green is willing to give him $36, but that's it, no more. So he says, again, I'm not interested in his money, I want to meet him. So when she came back to Professor Velvel Green a third time or a fourth time and indicated that he wants to meet the professor and money is not the issue, he acquiesced. He says, tell him that I'm really not interested in the things that interest him. We're in different universes, different worlds, but I can spare a half an hour. So Rabbi Feller came to see him with his black suit and his black hat and his black tie and his beard. So the way he tells the story, for the first 10 or 15 minutes, he was lecturing Rabbi Feller about how he looked. Get rid of the beard, get rid of the black hat, get rid of the black suit. If you want to reach Jews in this part of the world, you have to look like us. And Rabbi Feller was incredibly understanding, nodding and agreeing. And of course, you understand quite well that that was just part of the thing that you had to do in this business. And when Rabbi Green was done with his own stuff, now it was Rabbi Feller's turn to explain to him why he was there. And almost as soon as he started, he looked out the window and he saw that it was getting dark and he hadn't davened mincha yet. And he apologized and he muttered to Professor Velvel Green that he's apologizing for disrupting the meeting, but, quote, he had a prior appointment. He had an appointment with Mebishtin. And he turned around and he davened mincha. And Mr. Green said, I was sitting at my desk, I didn't know if I could eat or if I could work or if I could breathe. Anyway, by the time Rabbi Feller was done with mincha, the meeting was over and he left. And Rabbi Feller was under the impression that he would never see Velvel Green again. He had really burnt that bridge. It wasn't a successful meeting. What he did not know was that as soon as he walked out of the office, Velvel picked up the phone, and he called up his wife, and he said to his wife, he called up and said, Gail, I met one. So she says to him, I met one what? So he says, I met a Jew. She says, what do you mean you met a Jew? We're Jewish. She says, no, I meant a Jew, like in the book. That I met a Jew, we made a nefesh al kiddush Hashem. And of course, this was the beginning of an incredible relationship. If you read his books, you realize that there was a time that he was like the second Chabad house. The one lived in Minnesota, one lived in St. Paul, the other one lived in Minneapolis. And his house was near the university. Literally, he had a base Chabad for a number of years in his home. The relationship was incredibly deep, and ultimately he met the Rebbe. His family became from. He put his children in Jewish schools, and on and on and on. Anyway, what's so incredible about this little story is that I remember an occasion, I think it was like Yud Nissen time, and maybe it was Memches, but I don't remember, I didn't look it up, when the Rebbe repeated the story by Fabrengen. The Rebbe told this story in the presence of Rabbi Feller and in the presence of Velvel Green. It was very unusual. The Rebbe told this Maaseh about how he davened mincha rather than spend his time talking to him and the impact that it made. That this is real. This is emes. Anyway, this is all preliminary. I want to get to the following, that Velvel Green eventually met the Rebbe and developed a profound relationship with the Rebbe. If you're interested, you have to read the whole story, how they went to Warsaw and they saw the ghetto It was still destroyed. Him and his wife went. It was early 1960s. And she was very moved by it. It's a whole bunch of steps that happened in their journey. And he writes about all of it in his book, or books. And they're really worthwhile reading. But one of the things that he talks about is the relationship with the Rebbe. I think he met the Rebbe the first time for Yitas Kislev. He would come for Yechidus, and the Rebbe would talk to him. If I'm not mistaken, when he would meet the Rebbe alone, they would talk in Yiddish. When he came with his wife, they would talk in English. But I may be wrong about that detail. And they had a very deep bond. Eventually he put on a beard. I mean, he was a very important person. And in the early years of Shlichus, he was a big attraction. If Chabad wanted to bring a person who was from the modern world that was giving the Chabad pitch, he was the perfect person because he was a professor, a very smart guy, had a very successful career, did amazing things during the course of his professional career. But he also did a lot for Yiddishkeit, for the Rebbe, for Chassidus, and so on, and for Afotza, for Shlichus. Anyway, but the story that I want to tell is this, that he once had what amounted to a difference of opinion with the Rebbe. The Rebbe had written some letters way back when about the age of the universe. The Rebbe believed and argued and argues that there's a young earth. The earth is thousands of years old, whether they're billions of years old. And there's a number of letters from the Rebbe where the Rebbe addresses this question to a professor who objected to the Rebbe's position. And the Rebbe defended his position and explained it. And Velvel Green was unhappy with the Rebbe's explanation. And he came to Rabbi Feller and complained that he felt that the Rebbe's explanations were inadequate. It was sort of pseudo-intellectual. It was generalizing rather than being specific and so forth. So Rabbi Feller said to him, write to the Rebbe, ask him. You ask the Rebbe everything, ask him this also. So, again, the way I understand this story, he was initially reluctant, and then he finally did, and the Rebbe didn't answer him. He wrote to the Rebbe did not respond. In his mind, the Rebbe's lack of response was a form of acquiescence, like in Halacha, like in Likutei Torah, Shikir Kehedo, when two people argue. For one to win and for the other to lose, it's not necessary for the loser to say, I lose. All the loser has to do is be silent, and that's the greatest statement of you're right. So he had no option but to make that determination. The Rebbe didn't answer him. Anyway, a while later, I've heard this story in so many different ways, but if not mistaken, the way he tells the story, which means the way the story actually occurred, he put his children in a Jewish school, which was a big deal, it was a big step. And at that point, the Rebbe wrote him a letter congratulating him on putting his children in a Jewish school, from Jewish school. And in conjunction with that, the Rebbe writes, now that you've chosen to put your children in Jewish school, I'm going to use this opportunity and now answer the questions that he'd written about the age of the earth. And the Rebbe wrote him a long letter, and he explained himself, and he was very happy with the Rebbe's explanation. Anyway, he met the Rebbe in Yechidus later, and he asked the Rebbe why the Rebbe did not respond when he had asked. When he asked the question, the Rebbe ignored him. And the Rebbe sort of responded not in response to his questions, but in response to him taking another very significant Jewish step in his life and their family's life. And the Rebbe was sort of giving him almost like a reward for having done something Jewish to advance his Jewishness. So again, I've heard different versions of the story. The version of the story I heard growing up was that the Rebbe said to him, quote, if I had answered you then, you would not be where you are today. And of course, the meaning of that answer is that if I had answered you, we would have gotten into an argument. The argument would have created a barrier. By not answering you, that barrier wasn't put up, and you were able to progress as a Jew. And the version I heard more recently was the Rebbe said to him, I'd rather lose an argument and win a Jew than win an argument and lose a Jew, which of course is very real. Because in vikuach, in debate, right and wrong matters so much less than winning and losing. And if you have an interest in winning Jews, in other words, if you have an interest not in showing that you're smarter than the next guy, but you have an interest in waking up Jewish souls, winning arguments is not at all important. Winning souls is important, and you don't win souls by butting heads, by locking horns. So this is the story. Now, in his books, when he writes about his relationship with the Rebbe, he says almost in these words that he knew very early on that the Rebbe had extra dimensions that he didn't have access to. I guess to just say it succinctly, he understood that the Rebbe has prophecy strengths, prophecy powers, vision, or enlightenment. In other words, he appreciated that the difference between him and the Rebbe was not that the Rebbe was smarter than him, or much smarter than him, or much, much smarter than him, but the Rebbe was in touch with things that most people are not in touch with. And he appreciated that consequently the Rebbe operates from a different place. In other words, if it's a measure of intelligence, and one person has so much intelligence, and another person has a greater intelligence or a lesser intelligence, it's you can quantify it, you can measure it, it's kamos, it's quantity. He appreciated from pretty early on that the Rebbe has extra senses. The Rebbe knows things in different ways that are enlightened. And this, of course, put a context on whatever disagreements he may have had with the Rebbe. Meaning to say, even though he doesn't perhaps disagree with the Rebbe on all kinds of issues, and conceivably, not everything that Rebbe held, he held, I'm talking now as a scientist, but there was this understanding that because the Rebbe is a different kind of person with different kind of sensitivities, the Rebbe knows what he's talking about. Even if it doesn't make sense to him, the Rebbe knows what he's talking about. And he created a certain peace in their bond, in their connection, in their relationship. And I suppose in this little story that I shared, where he was upset that the Rebbe answered a question in science in a way that he considered pseudo-intellectual, not adequate, not sufficient, because of who the Rebbe was and how he appreciated the Rebbe, it put a context, it put a limit on the frustration, on the challenge that he had and so on. This is the point that I wanted to share as the introduction to today's class. There are smart people, there are smarter people, and then there are enlightened people. Enlightened people are not smarter, they just know things in a different way. They know things from the neshama. There's a certain clarity about it, and of course there's different degrees of enlightenment. There are people whose level of enlightenment is very limited, and people whose enlightenment is very deep. And a Rebbe, Nasi Yisrael's enlightenment is absolute. There's a clarity, he's a Yedei Asides, he can see the future very clearly and so on. All of this comes from this oyer, from this light or this enlightenment. In other words, when a person has enlightenment, when a person has a connection to Hashem, which is not based on his mind and his proof and his understanding, but it's based on something higher, that person's relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu is in a completely different category. It's a totally different level. Rambam, when the Rambam talks about prophecy, he says that when a person experiences Nevuah even once, Nepach L'Ish Acher, he becomes a new person. I happen to be reading in one of my shiurim, Sefer Shmuel, and I'm reading the story of how Shaul HaMelech meets Shmuel HaNovi, and then he experiences prophecy for the first time, and the Pasuk describes he becomes a new person. Because an enlightened person is not just smarter, he just has a clarity that comes from the neshama, from godliness. Of course, it trickles down into the mind, but it's a different mind. It's a mind that has a clarity based on something which is before the mind, or higher than the mind, this kind of enlightenment, this kind of clarity. For people like us, we're not enlightened, and the reason we're not enlightened is because we're not smart enough, right? The Jewish belief, the Jewish philosophy is that the prerequisite to Nevuah is, amongst other things, Chokhmah, the deepest intellectuals who are sholem, who have a wholeness, have a health in their intellect, in all areas of knowledge, and there's a groundedness about their knowledge, there's a humility about that knowledge, there's a joy about their lives, are open to experiencing enlightenment, and in the wording of the Rambam, sometimes lo yishre. Occasionally Hashem will give him the prophecy or the enlightenment, occasionally he won't. We're not on that level. But the way you would apply that idea is through emunah, tmimus. Smart we're not on this level. I mean, intelligence is a relative thing, but the intelligence of Nevi'im is of a whole different caliber. To be zoiche, to an oida leki with a ruach hakodesh, with a divine spirit, we don't have. But tmimus, sincerity, we can have. Pshitos, simplicity, and emunah we can have. Our tmimus, our pshitos, and our emunah doesn't have the authority, doesn't have the power of the ruach hakodesh of an enlightened person, but it shares the simple reality. God is real. World, I don't know. God is real. The world we can debate, but the Eibishter is real. That's what Emunah gives. That's what Tmimus gives. Unfortunately, we live in an age of reason. And we live in an age of information. We live in an age of incredible access to knowledge. And people get very, very involved into intellectualizing, making the idea of God and religion and prophecy and Mount Sinai and communication and miracles and divine providence into things that they need to understand or prove. Right? In the modern world, everything has to be proven. And when they speak about things being proven in the modern world, what they don't say, but they infer is that for something to be considered empirical, absolutely true, it can't be proven philosophically, it has to be proven physically. If you can't prove it physically, then it's not proven, and unfortunately too many people have this simplistic hinge that says if it's not been proven absolutely, then it's been absolutely proven that it isn't, which is of course silly. And the whole idea of metaphysics, of the abstract, of philosophy it's considered a fairy tale. It's considered, nice, interesting, but as they call it, unprovable. And the tragedy is that you can only prove physical things physically, and the Eibush is not a physical thing. And when people get caught up in this world, they get very distracted from their emunah. They get very distracted from their tmimos. They get very distracted from their pshitos. And the argument is, I'm looking for the proof. Now, is the proof there or is the proof not there? That's question number one. But it doesn't matter what the answer to that question is. The cost of looking for this proof is that you deprive yourself of what is the simple person's equivalent of Ruach HaKodesh, a relationship with God. I've talked about this many times over the years, how I met a man who was an engineer, brilliant man, who was coming to my Tanya class, and when I talked to him about science and religion, he said he had no answers to the conflict between science and religion questions. So I asked him why he was at a Tanya class, and he says, I don't care. I want a relationship with God. In other words, his relationship with God had nothing to do with his intellect, because he understood that God is real, whether his brain can synthesize, can bring together his particular discipline in engineering and in physical sciences, and his relationship with the Eibishter. When we get caught up in needing to have proof, even if we find the proof, we don't have a relationship with Hashem that's free. Or to say what I'm saying in other words, and I guess this is a bit of a stretch from my initial point. There's an expression in the English language which was originally meant to be one of derision, one of an insult, if you will, which is true. And that expression is a leap of faith. But to be able to believe, you have to make a leap. Now the connotation, the meaning behind the phrase a leap of faith, as it was intended by the inventor of the term, is that faith is blind. You have a mind, and you have a series of intellectual steps that you take, experiments, if you will, that get you from one point of logic to a second point of logic to a third point of logic and a fourth point of logic, and somewhere along the chain there's a missing step. You make a leap, and then you continue with your theories of logic. And of course the argument is that the moment you make a leap, every step of logic subsequent to that has no credibility because it was a leap of faith. And it's meant to be derogatory, that people who believe, since it's without reason, it's without reason. It's not intelligent, it's not rational. But the terminology of leap of faith is real. It's not real because believers have a mental lapse, have an intellectual lapse. That's not true. Some of the smartest people in the world are believers. It's because proving that God exists and having a relationship with God are two entirely different things. Proving the truth of Torah, proving the truth of Sinai, proof shmoof, all the proofs in the world have nothing to do with religious health, with religious involvement with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And when you put up this wall around yourself that says, until you can convince me, I don't believe, like the Rasha, convince me, sell it to me. It's tragic, it's sad, because the intellectual barrier, it's not that the intellectual barrier can't be breached. In other words, it's not that there are no answers to the questions, but they don't make a difference. You don't make a person more involved in Yiddishkeit by answering questions and giving proofs. because usually that tract, that path, that channel will lead to an argument, and in arguments, right and wrong goes out the window, and the only thing that matters is truth and false. Truth and false go out the window. The only thing that matters is winning and losing. And even if you can bring a person to a place where intellectually, rationally, they say, "Yep, this is true," there is no religious component to that. It's if you will, there's a historic component to that. There is a physical component to that, a religious component. That means I have a relationship with God. And to have a relationship with God means you have to let go of your ego, let go of your mind, and have a neshama connection, a spiritual connection. So you have to make a leap of faith, whether your faith is based on reason, your faith is not based on reason, because the leap of faith is what faith is. If it's all about proof, it's all about logic, then you don't have a relationship with God. You just have proof of God, like you proof of anything else. And many things people have proof for, and then they do the exact opposite because it doesn't matter to them that much. So this is what's going on in some circles, that people, even from people, are so busy with their minds. They're so busy needing to logically work things through. And they fail to see the spiritual cost for them, for their families, even if you can find answers. And of course, the people in that world consider themselves superior. They're smart, they're educated, they're academics, and they look at people who approach religion with a simplicity as being simplistic and foolish. They fail to realize that 1 ounce of faith is more valuable than 1,000 pounds of proof. Because faith is real. Faith is a connection to God. And all this logic is ultimately a barrier, a wall between a person and his relationship to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, why am I saying all of this? What's the context for this conversation? And of course, we've been learning now together for almost a decade, Baruch Hashem. And we've covered quite a bit of Likutei Torah and Torah 8, and now, of course, the Ramadim of the Rebbe. The reason I'm bringing it up is because our Maamar is in effect talking about this. Our Maamar talks about Bina versus Chochmah. Bina means understanding, and Chochmah means intellectual intuition or creativity. And he compares it to So'irim and Chitim, barley and wheat, or to Pesach and Shavuos. And he makes the argument that the concept of So'ir means barley, Shin Ayin Vav Reish, is from the same word as Sha'ar, or a gate, or a Sar, which means a hair, that allows life to flow from one point to another through a contracted, through a contained, through a limited prism. And in other words, in Kabbalistic wording, something that's delivered from a higher level to a lower level through what would be, in effect, a tzimtzum, a containment, a contraction. And the argument is that when a person approaches Hashem through So'irim, the relationship to Hashem is based on logic and reason, and ultimately even something as superficial as proof, something external as proof. Proof of something is the most superficial level of involvement with it. That you prove something exists is only one thing. Then you have to understand what it is, right? Assuming you could prove that God exists, explaining what God is an entirely different search, and it's a much deeper one. And the argument that the Rebbe gives is the word So'irim, barley, which was the carbon used on Pesach, represents the whole idea of shiur and containment. In effect, this means that the truth of Hashem has been limited to logic, to ideas, to proof. Which means that even when you have a relationship with the Eibishter, it's a very limited relationship. In the Maamar, he talked about the emotions, the Ava v'Yira, that comes from that level of Seichel, but in its entirety, all of it, the entire system, is external. It's limited emotion coming from intellectual involvement of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is limited. The opposite of that is what follows. We're on line 102, by the way, for those who want to follow us inside. This is our second class on the Maamar Usfartem, which is a Likutei Torah in Parshas Bamidbar, connected to Shavuos. And what the Rebbe wants to argue now is that there's something called Chochmah. Chochmah is called the intuitive intellectual tool, or the creative intellectual tool, which means it's your mind. Your mind is your seichel. But it's the level of your mind that's close enough to the abstract that it relates to things in an enlightened way. It experiences the light of something, not just the proof of it. Not the cumbersome, heavy, involved mathematics that corroborate, that support, or that establish that something is true, but the intuitive beginning of that. And in that intuitive beginning, there's a huge richness, a huge clarity, a huge certainty. In Tanya chapter 29, Tanya Perek of Tes, near the end of the Perek, the Alter Rebbe discusses a person who's trapped in a condition of Timtum Alev, where for whatever reason, they have a great mind, they have a sensitive heart, but the mind cannot reach the heart. The heart can't feel what the mind senses or knows. And when one recognizes that there's a timtum, there's a block, so the Alter Rebbe brings the Zohar that says, that sometimes you have to smash it to allow the wood to be ignited. Sometimes you have to smash the neshama for the fire of the soul to ignite the person. So the Alter Rebbe goes through a whole bunch of examples, a whole long story about how one beats the wood, so to speak, proverbially, so that the fire should be ignited. And near the end of the chapter, the Alter Rebbe says, this is beneficial, it helps the person. And he writes the expression that a person should come to a clarity about the Eibishter, which is called Riyah Chushes Mamish V'lei Shmiya V'avana Levad. As if you could see God. But he doesn't say as if you could see God. You can vividly see God. It's not just understanding. Those words are very compelling, very powerful. But the Alter Rebbe says, a person yesterday he was stuck, and today he's not only unstuck, but has a clarity like as if he could see. That clarity, like as if you could see, in big people, is a Ruach HaKodesh. It's an enlightenment. And in ordinary people, in me and you, it's faith, it's tmimus. It's, there's two things. A, having answers to questions. B, not having questions. B is much more important than A in religion. Even though as intellectuals, we would like to think that B is simplistic, or as the kids like to say, blind faith as opposed to simple faith. But in reality, faith is very real and very important and very infinite. And to be burdened, to be weighted down by the constant need for intellectual corroboration for our spiritual life, steals. It absolutely steals. It robs us of our ruchnius. And the Alter Rebbe is trying to teach a person how to emancipate himself from that heaviness and experience clarity, experience, the ordinary person's phenomena of enlightenment, and he calls it like as if you could see. That's the expression that he uses. I just want to share, in terms of this lengthy introduction, that I saw someplace where the Rebbe was asked. Somebody said to the Rebbe, "You're a very smart guy, very intelligent, very well educated. Isn't faith without reason? Isn't faith simplistic? Isn't faith lacking depth and intellectual authority?" And the Rebbe gave him a wonderful answer. The Rebbe said, faith is not lacking intellect. It's a different skill. It's a different skill set. It's a different thing. Like, for example, would you call an artist or a musician or a dancer smart or stupid, intelligent or unintelligent? And of course the answer to that question is neither. His chush, his skill has nothing to do with being smart or not being smart. It's a different field. And the same is true with faith. Faith is not with reason or without reason. It's apart from reason. And when we don't appreciate that, and we insist on saying, well, I'm too smart to be that silly to believe, we steal from ourselves something so meaningful, so real, so important, so emancipating, so life-giving, so joy-motivating. And we insist that this is because we have integrity, and we're depressed by our own ego and our own intellectual box, and we steal from ourselves this incredible gift of faith. And Chassidus talks about the need to have faith. And like I said before, in Tanya chapter 29, one of many places where this idea is articulated in very clear words. So in the context of this Maamar, that's Chokhmah. Chokhmah means having a relationship with Hashem which is not burdened by the analytical process, by the Bina heaviness, if you will, which analyzes and dissects and studies. And even though Bina comes to the conclusions that Chokhmah enlightened, and it translates into Eimaban Mismech, it brings joy and happiness and emotional passion to the person, it's stuck in that heaviness. Chokhmah knows by way of enlightenment. And of course, many people don't trust their Chokhmah, and they shouldn't. But if you could trust your Chokhmah, and in those instances where Chokhmah deserves trust, your faith connection to Hashem is simpler and realer and richer. It's true. And the argument of the Rebbe that that's wheat, chita, which we have on Shavuos. Pesach, the carbon that was brought with shtei halechem from barley, which permitted chodesh to be eaten in the countryside and in all of Eretz Yisrael and so on. And on Shavuos they brought the shtei halechem, which was made from wheat, and it also was chametz. But our Maimon makes no reference to the chametz at all. It simply speaks about barley and wheat. And the argument that Rabbi puts forth is that the wheat represents the chokhmah, this higher level of intellect, which is almost not intellectual, where the clarity is absolute, and the relationship with Hashem is therefore real and infinite. And ironically quiet. It's deeper and quieter. And of course the argument of this Maimon is that chokhmah is better than bina. Wheat is better than barley. Shavuos is higher than Pesach. So a person who has the wisdom and the maturity and the grown-upness to appreciate that this is what he wants, this is what we all want. We want a relationship with God, and we want a relationship with God not to be about heaviness, but about clarity and faith, pursues this point of Chokhmah, which is strongly connected to the Yom Tov of Shavuos. And this is where we're holding in the Maimon, and I guess I've kept you waiting long enough, so let's get to the text. Let's begin to read in Pei Gimel of the Maimon. The Rebbe V'hinei. Kol Zeh, what we discussed in the last class, Hu B'chinas Se'era, is the category of barley. Shemazgala bePesach Reishes K'tzirchem, which is revealed on Pesach as the beginning of the harvest. And of course, philosophically, the word Se'or, Shin Ayin, Vav Reish, is linked to the word Shaira, Sa'ar, hair, which goes on a contraction, and the word Shar, a gateway. But even a gateway is a framework that has a certain superficiality to it from a mystical perspective. Shehui inyan hasagas hanefesh. It's the soul's access, the soul's reach. Bechinas Gilead in Tzei Baruch Hu, in as much as experiencing and revealing godliness is concerned, but it's Balma des Gali, as godliness is revealable. Godliness revealable in the light of my introduction would be godliness based on proof, or godliness based on understanding. Like I mentioned, the most superficial level of knowing anything is proving it. A deeper level of knowing something is understanding it. In some secular circles, proving that God exists is not sufficient until they can define what God is, which of course is very difficult to do. Proving that revelation, that prophecy exists, is very different than explaining what revelation is, and so on and so forth. And in the Alma des Galia realm, even if you know it intellectually, in the kind of way that affects the emotion, it's burdened by this need to prove things, or even to understand them, which brings the godliness down to a much lower level, and it robs from it its sincerity, its peacefulness, its infinity, if you will. How godliness reveals itself in the world, the godliness embraces the world, etc. But it's an intellectual exercise, the whole nefesh according to each person, to the extent that one's intellectual reach can carry. When one will delve deeply with his das, and consider the greatness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, each one according to his own measure. And notice the word shi'ura, shi'ur, se'oir, sa'ar. And because it's giluyim based, if you were by the last class, that's how we described it. Because it's based on revelation, godliness reaching us, oides bekedim, us understanding, it's limited, very exciting and very passionate, but very, very on the outside. Continues the Rabbi on line 107. Ach, b'Shavuos v'gilu b'chinas chita. When you get to Shavuos, the revelation of wheat. And of course, the way this played itself out was this was the beginning of Chodosh in the Beis HaMikdash from Chita. On Pesach, when you brought the carbonate of barley, it allowed Chodosh to be eaten in Eretz Yisrael, but not in the Beis HaMikdash. On Shavuos, when they brought the carbon shtei halechem, it allowed for wheat to be used from the new crop, from the Chodosh, even in the Beis HaMikdash. And this is called wheat. Now, as I mentioned to you, in a lot of the Maimorim, they associate the difference between Shavuos, Pesach and Shavuos with matzah and chametz, and I'll probably talk about this in my introduction to the next class on this Maimon. But in this Maimer, there is no reference made to chametz and matzah. It's simply sa'irim and chitim. And the Rabbi says immediately, Shugilui mashalamayla madaz vasaga. Wheat represents the idea of revealing what's beyond understanding. Now, if it's beyond understanding, how is it revealed? And if it's beyond understanding, what's the credibility of that revelation? And the real answer to that question is that's what Ruach HaKodesh is. That's what Nevuah is. You have a mind. And to use a classic Hasidic terminology, your mind operates in a model, in a system, in a framework that's called Oides Bekelim. Light coming into vessels. Now, Oides Bekelim has many aspects. One of the aspects of Oides Bekelim is words. I have ideas, I can put them into words, I can articulate them, I can share them with you. And of course, if I can find language for my ideas, you can understand them through the words I use and either agree with them or question them. What happens if a person has an enlightenment and they don't have words? They can't find a language to communicate it. So they may know the greatest secrets in the universe, but they have no way of sharing it with another. They certainly have no way of convincing another. This is really what enlightenment is. When you cross over the bridge from a level of intellect, which is Oides Bekelim, which is human in the sense that it can be put into words, that can be expressed in the brain and through the brain and the mouth or the pen or whatever the case is, in a way that it can be shared. Enlightened ideas. This is actually mentioned in Ayim Yom when he talks about Ruach HaKodesh, and he brings up Karban Eidan Yerushalmi that calls it Talumis Chochma. The point at which your brain has information that's simply not wordifyable. You can't put them into words. So you can say that it's silly. But the person who knows it knows that what he knows is real and actual. It's just beyond form. Or to say it in a more comprehensive way, the credibility of a Navi or a Baruch HaKodesh is the Chochmah that came first. A Tippish is not a Navi. A Shaita is not a Navi. A fool that experiences enlightenment is not trusted. If you are a deep Chocham, and it's been established that you have great intellect, and that you have broad knowledge, and have a healthy understanding of the world, and the various different levels in it, the human experience, and the spiritual experience, and the divine experience, Ma'aseh Bereishis, Ma'aseh Merkava. So such a person, when they have an enlightenment, people don't have the ability to test their enlightenment, but they have the ability to test that person, because that person has an enormous amount of credibility. And the credibility that person had until that point lends credibility to when the person crosses over to the other side and experiences enlightenment. This is how it is in Torah. So the person has access to ideas that they may have a very difficult time or find it impossible to share with you, but you trust them because of who they are, that what they're saying has reality. And certainly they trust them. This is a metaphor, this is an illustration for what it means to relate to Hashem not through the heaviness of the brain, but if you will, the lightness of the soul, the enlightenment of the neshama. And it's the difference between sa'ir or shi'ur or sa'ar and chita. So when you say that it's above wisdom, you don't mean that it's not logical, that it's not philosophical, that it's not with integrity. It means it's a clarity and a simplicity which simply is beyond being put into words. And the Rebbe continues on line 108 to Kamaimer, as the Gemara puts it, Eitadas Chita Hoisa. The tree of knowledge of good and evil, for which Adam and Chava ate in the beginning of time, was a wheat. And I'm sure you know this, it says in Rishonim, it says in Sfarim, that there are 4 opinions in Chazal of what the Eitadas was. And one thing none of the opinions hold was it was certainly not an apple. The movies all describe the Eitadas as being an apple, and I have no idea why, although you could bring instances where Chakal Tapuchin, right, Rashi says, a state Tapuchim. So there is a place in mysticism, in, forgive me for saying bad words, in Jewish mythology for an apple. But when it comes to Eitadas, Tevara, there are only 4 opinions. One opinion is that it's an esrig. Another opinion is that it's a wheat. Another opinion is that it's a grape. Another opinion is that it's a fig. And the Rabbi Bechaya, I believe, connected to the 4 aces of Shem Havaya, Yud Kei Vav Kei, each one being on a different level. And one of them is that it's a wheat, which is why in Halacha, wheat, which is a grain, is considered Pri Ha'etz and not Pri Ha'adama. But that's a discussion for another time. But look how the Rebbe follows up, 109. The Gemara says, a child does not know how to identify his father until he tastes bread. And here the Rebbe explains this mashal very well. This expression, is used very often in explaining Lavanya and Matzah. That it's called katnos abba, all kinds of things. And the argument is that when you eat bread that has no taste, is not allowed to rise, it's das, it's a clarity, it's a certitude of katnos. It doesn't come from the intellect, it comes from just knowing, from faith, which is really what matzah is. It's das, the katnos. But here the Rebbe is going to talk about it really more in light of Shavuos than in light of Pesach. The Rebbe is going to argue that way a child knows his father, he knows his father with certitude, although it's not an intellectual or a proof-based or a logic-based awareness, it's a deeper kind of an awareness. Let's let the Rebbe talk. Amar line 109. The awareness of a child that reaches out to his father and his mother, you cannot call it knowledge which is revealed. Revealed would mean that it's in the brain of that child, in form, in words, that can be explained in words. V'hasaga v'havana, with intellectual reach and intellectual understanding. Hamuskelis, I like to translate the word muskelis as that is intuited, because muskel is connected to chokhmah, betam musagam, on a level of understanding which is accessible and understandable. In other words, logic which can be articulated in words. The child has no clue what makes his father his father. He doesn't understand at all why he's his father. Why he should love his father. He nevertheless calls to his father. There's a bond. That's a nefesh bond, the soul bond between the child and the father. It doesn't have any reason. So the child intuits, he knows from a very deep place, this is my father, this is my mother, and doesn't understand. But not understanding doesn't make it less, it actually makes it simpler. It's more, it's an infinite connection. To be sure, moreover, so this bond, which is not based on proof and logic and understanding, is chazak made incredibly strong. In other words, he longs for his father. If his father were to depart, it would be very painful for him. He would cry. His crying would pour forward his very soul in his desperation to be attached and continue his closeness with his father. 115. The reason why this is what the child knows. As a result of eating wheat. Now, normally it's associated with bread. Here it's associated specifically with wheat. And we don't know how to explain this. Is this an inyan from segula? Or this an inyan from teva? Is it that somehow eating bread affects a person's awareness? Is it sort of like a miracle, a magic, that when a person eats bread affects their awareness? Or is it that at the age that you're able to eat bread, you're able to connect? But those questions, those uncertainties we're going to leave alone. What is true is that when the child eats this bread, it exposes the das of the child. That means the connectivity, the sense of bonding with other things that's deep. And because it's deep, it's beyond das, knowledge, which is understandable, which is reachable and understandable intellectually. It's intuitive. Now you see, you could argue that that's peripheral, that's superficial, that's pseudo-intellectual. But the opposite is also true. It's not burdened by the heaviness of proof. And I know how that sounds to a proof-based human being. But what I'm arguing is the proof-based human being is living in a world that's so diminished because they have no connection to anything that's spiritual. And this trap of, if till I can prove it, it isn't real. Until it's real, according to my proof, I don't want to explore it, impoverishes them and makes them very poor. It's very sad and very real. And I don't know what else to say, so I'm going to keep on going. V'lachein, 117, accordingly. His kashrus shaloi, the bond of this little boy or girl who's eaten bread, chosko me'ed, is very strong. Admita nefesh mamash, it touches the very essence, the very core of his soul. Ki ahavazu, because the nature of this love, niflei samayed, it is incredibly pele, wondrous. Mikashatu chal hanefesh seis, from what the soul is able to tolerate in the cavities, in the kelim of its form or of its body, which would mean the vessels of the mind and the heart. Hasagasa is intellectual reach. Ve'ein keach benefesh, the soul does not have the strength lichle yeseruach, to satisfy it, to control this spirit. Ha'ava of love sheyeseidasa v'sharsha she'emenu lukcha, because its foundation and its root, from which it radiates, is das hanela. There's a connectivity, is a connection which is called ne'elam, which comes from such a deep place that's beyond intellect. In other words, sometimes you could know something, and you can know it with absolute certitude, but you know it from the inside. You don't know it from the outside. No, so someone outside of you calls you a fool, but you know that it's real. And you also appreciate what that person is missing because of the need to prove it. And that's what faith really is, this knowledge of God from the inside. And it's sad when people are deprived of it, and it's doubly sad when they deprive themselves of it. Shu elyin v'gaveya, this is above and beyond, mihadas hamispashet b'kechas hanefesh v'hasagasa, from the level of intellectual connectivity which is connected to the revealed faculties, or to the oiris b'kelim, the light in vessels, conscious human experience, which is able to understand things and able to prove things, but in a very superficial way, very external way. This reveals a hiddenness as it is by itself, and as a consequence, leaves bittul kechas hanefesh. So the way our faculties operate, my mind, my heart, and my ego, is bittled by that clarity and by that transcendence. That the soul desires to be one with HaKadosh Baruch Hu and lose itself. That's the meaning of the Gemara. And we've, of course, we've been learning now Likutei Torah for so many years, and we've learned Baruch Hashem many Maamorim, and we've come across this Maamar a number of times. But this particular form of explaining it has a certain clarity and directness, which is perhaps greater than we've learned about another Maamorim. Now, 123. V'hine, in concert with all of these words, in a way which is consistent with the analogy we just gave, it explains the relationship between the holiday of Shavuos, which is 7 weeks after the holiday of Pesach, and the offering up of wheat for the first time in the season on Shavuos, in contrast to the barley which was offered up on Pesach. And of course, it's connected to the occasion when the Eibusha gave us the Torah that the Gemara says, "Shall kol diba parcha nishmasam." God spoke and the neshama expired. Because what happened at Har Sinai, was not an intellectual event. What happened at Har Sinai was entirely a spiritual or a mystical or a godly event. And therefore, our reaction to it was Mesiras Nefesh, the sacrifice of one's soul, Limsen Nafshe Bechod, that Yidden collectively gave their souls in the experience of the oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Machmas Gilui, B'chinas Anechi Mishanechi, because at Har Sinai there's a relation of God Almighty Himself that's denoted, that's referred to by the phrase Anoichi. Anoichi means I. Chassidishe brings down that the word Anoichi is Ani with a Chaf. Ani means the Eibishter himself, but Ani is Ani Tefillah Malchus. Ani with a Chaf was Keser. Anoichi means I in the absolute sense. And Anechi, Mishanechi, Hu B'chinas Atzmusim Husi Yisbarach, that means the Eibishter himself. And of course, Atzmus means, the way I translated the Elokus, as he is in relationship with itself, and Mus means the substance of that. There's no way to grasp it. There's no way to reach it at all, because God is ungraspable. Now, of course, if you've learned Tanya, you know, but nitfas iyu, Merusa Liebe, it says in Zayad, or in Chassidus it says, in Tanya it says, that in nitfas iyu, Kiyam kasha tfiso mislabeshes beteru mitzvah. In Yiddishkeit you have Atzmus and Hussein Baruch Hu, and in Chita you have a sense, you have an awareness, you have an experience of that Atzmus and Hus. Ubazeh Yuvan, line 128, and of course this explains Masha Kosov, what's written in the Torah, Onei Hashem Elokecha Shetesicha Met Mitzrayim. When the Eibishter gave us the Torah, He introduced Himself to us. And introduced Himself to us with the word Anochi, I, Atzmus Amhus, Havaya Lekecha, Asher Tesicha Me'eretz Mitzrayim, they took us out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage, and he gave us the Torah. Now, before we continue to read, let me share this with you, okay? There are many Maimorim, not this one, but other Maimorim, that make the following observation, ask the following question. Hashem gave us a Seres HaDibros. Hashem gave us 10 commandments. And it says in Chassidus, it's brought in Ayem Yem, that that's fatal matan Torah vet nicht sein. Even when Mashiach comes, it's not going to be another occasion of Hashem giving us the Torah. The Torah Chadash B'Titeitze was also given in Har Sinai, and never then, as the Rabbi says in the Sicha of Shavuos Tavshin and Aleph, it was Helam Chanin B'Mitzias. So God came down on a mountain once and gave us 10 commandments once. Never did it again. Will never do it again. And the question that's asked is that in the entire Seres HaDibros, there's not one original thought. Hashem gives a shir, and there's no chiddush. Most of the 10 commandments were included in the Sheva Mitzvahs P'nei. Most of the Seres HaDibros are for the 7 laws of Noach. And the handful that weren't, like Kibbud Avayim and Shabbos, we were given at Morah. We also had from before. Before Har Sinai, we were given certain mitzvahs. Amongst them were the outstanding Seres HaDibros, which means that by the time we got the 10 commandments, we knew them all from before. So the Welt sagt Akasha, Zaga Chiddush. You're coming down on a mountain, you're revealing yourself once, never before, never again, and you say things people already know. And the answer to this question is, and Maamar Chassidus explained it this way, is because Har Sinai was not about ideas. The ideas, the laws, the mitzvahs we got through Moshe Rabbeinu. First at Har Sinai, and then in Eyal Meid, and then in Arvis Me'av, Kiyadum first. What happened at Har Sinai was we got God. He gave us himself. And he was careful to say no chedushim in Seres HaDibros, so that it should be absolutely unequivocally clear that what he's giving us is not information and not laws, it's himself. And the laws and information carried the Anechi, they carried the Ani, they carried the Eibishter himself. And we learned them, of course, in Teresh Balpeh, from Moshe Rabbeinu, from Seder Limud, and so on and so forth. But Har Sinai was Anechi. God gave us himself. That's the story of Seres HaDibros. Here, the Rebbe is going to focus on another aspect of this pasuk, although it's not a contradiction to what I just said. They're mutually inclusive. What's going to be the focus in this pasuk? On the terminology, Asher Tesicha Me'eret Mitzrayim took us out of the land of Egypt. Line 129. The idea that Hashem took us out of Egypt is not such a big deal. And by the way, this kasha is asked in Rishonim, I think it's in Even Ezra or Rabbi Bechaya, who say, it should say, I am the God, your God, who created heaven and earth. Creating heaven and earth is Yesh Mayayim. And of course, according to the Rambam and the Alter Rebbe and Chassidus, it's B'chol Rega V'Rega, every instant. Hashem creates everything from a non-existential state into an actual Metzias existential state, which we call Yesh Mayayim Ex Nihila Acharei HaHeder. And why would you say that Hashem took us out of Egypt? Before we went out of Egypt, we existed in Mitzrayim. After we went out of Egypt, we existed outside Mitzrayim. So the Shin is only Yesh Mayash, and arguably that the Eibishter created the world is a bigger deal. It's a far greater point. Asher asa shamayim va'oros. They create heaven and earth because b'riyasam yesh mayayim. Heaven and earth are created from a non-existential state to an independently existential state. V'gam shamayim l'reim va'oros la'emek. In addition, their universe is so massive, so expansive, and going from terra firma Egypt to terra firma non-Egypt is not such a big deal. And this is one of the many questions which are asked on this pasuk. I'm on line 132. Now the answer is based on what we said before. The reason we say because we're talking about limit and going out of limit, and Mitzrayim represents limits. The word Mitzrayim is 2 words. Mesa, which means a narrowness, or Yam, a sea. And sometimes it's Meitzar Mi, by the way. And by the way, Shem Elokim is also Eile Yam or Eile Mi. Tahainu, this means Mashayam Chochma, there's a sea of Chochma. Then the context of this conversation. Chochma represents intuition. Chochma represents knowing in a direct and a real way, which gives a person powerful faith, rather than encumbered and burdened and heavy faith. It's stuck, it's contained, and it's limited because the human being insists on being proof, insists on understanding, and he gets so stuck in that even if he finds the understanding and he finds the proof, his God weighs a ton. And his faith is even heavier than that. Because only thing he knows is what he can know. V'hainu begil ziv v'harosei, a ray or a trace of a heyday of his glory, which is al eretz hashemayim, which is in heaven is v'chulu echshem malachim seif klamen v'chuli, and you're missing God, the truth. Line 136, Avo. When the Eibush gave us the Torah, he didn't give us himself through a containment, he gave us himself without any limitation whatsoever, which is represented by Anechi. At that point, we were emancipated from our own limitations, from our own inhibitions, and we were given the ability to have a real connection to God directly, or an infinite one. That is beyond human beings' understanding. And the Rebbe contains in line 137 that just like there's a geographic, a physical Mitzrayim, and the departure from the physical Mitzrayim brings us to Matan Torah and Anechi, the same is true also v'chein yesh b'chinas Mitzrayim lamata. There is Egypt in the psyche of a person. That Gashahod, Lamab'chinas Meitzera Gul, we all are contained, we're all limited by Mishigasan, one way or another. Each person according to how he is placed, but go from the containment of his body, which limits him not to go beyond his fence and beyond his limit, which is Mitzrayim. It's a psychological and spiritual Mitzrayim. When a human being accesses the Anoichi within himself, the Chochmah within himself, the Ein Sof within himself, the enlightenment within himself, or the faith within himself, the clarity which is comparable to the Yitzhak B'muchach. Like it says in Tanya Perek Lamed Aleph, says the Rebbe Azaytich, Seivetich love. The person suddenly has a love and a desperate desire to become one with HaKadosh Baruch Hu to the point of complete and utter sacrifice. Lord says me not take her to depart from the containment, for the container, the sheath and the shield. Humai said aguf, which is the containment of the body. With the readiness for b'mesilas nefesh mamish to make sacrifice of his nefesh mamish limbs, and nafsh to sacrifice his life be'echad, to become one with HaKadosh Baruch, or to experience the freedom of an involvement with HaKadosh Baruch. V'zehu mailas ha'madreg is Baal Tshuva Chul. The Rebbe calls this a Baal Tshuva. And I suppose the reason he calls it a Baal Tshuva is because they're coming from Mitzrayim, but it's the idea of being in touch with Chochmah, with Ein Sof, with faith, with enlightenment. And that happened when Hashem gave us the Torah. Sanecha Hashem Elokecha Shetesicha Me'eretz Mitzrayim means that when Hashem took us out of Egypt and He gave us the Torah, then He gave us Anochi. When we went out of Egypt, we lost our masters. When we got the Torah, we gained the freedom or the infinity of having a relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, with this faith and enlightenment. Line 142, accordingly, b'matan Torah, when God Almighty gave us the Torah, what is normally heard, they saw. And when there's normally seen, they heard. And he explains it as follows. Things that until that point were only heard. That means far away. That means having God through your brain and understanding, which makes the Eibush far away, which is the hiddenness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, was revealed and visible. I don't have the burden and the heaviness of physical proof to somehow corroborate my relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I have a sense of His presence inside of myself, and it's not unintelligent, and it's not unintellectual, it's beyond it. On the other hand, what was earlier available through vision and clarity, which is of course a lower level, ascends to an even higher level of bechinas helem, to the level of hiddenness, which is bechinas shmiya, the level of hearing, because they reveal the hiddenness alone. And what the Rebbe is saying is that shemin asanira, to hear what is normally seen, means that the things about godliness that you can see means that you're close to them. Hearing those things which you normally think about godliness means that you're now able to be close to things which are not available to you, that are naturally hidden from you, which is even higher, in other words. I'm just going to give you a thought to explain this a little bit that is a Maamar in Ayin Beis, and I'm sure it's based on my modem of the Rabbi before, that talks about the Pasuk Alei Oyin, Ben Peiros Yosef, Peiros Alei Oyin. Yosef HaTzadik is given the brachas by Yankov Avinu. It's called Ben Peiros. It says Alei Oyin, above the Ayin, and Ayin with an Ayin, Ayin Yud Nun. And of course it's explained in Rashi that it means he's above Ayin Hara and so on. But in Chassidishe it says Alei Oyin means higher than the Iyah. That above seeing godliness, which is the highest level we consciously know, there is understanding. But it's an understanding which is even deeper than seeing. And that's why Mukubalim are called Shimon. Shimon ben Yechoyah. Shmi is lower than the Iyah. And yet Shimon ben Yechoyah is not called Reuven, it's called Shimon, because there's a Hasaga which is higher than the Iyah. In the language of this Maimon, it would go this way, that what was far is close, and what was close is deep. And that's why it's called Shemon Asanir. And I'm going to leave this and move on. Line 146, Vihine. V'chino madregezu, this level of chokhmah, this level of clarity, enlightenment, absolute truth. Nimshach al Yisrael b'matan Torah. Reached the Jewish people when God Almighty gave us the Torah, because shenasinas ha-Torah, the event of the giving of the Torah is gilu b'chinazu. It's not just a book, it's not just rules, it's God. God gave us Himself at Sinai. Sha'atera v'ha-mitzvahs. Torah mitzvahs nimshach made and say baruch hu atzmei. Come from the Eibishter directly, mamish. And of course, it's b'chinas sahela matzmei, because it reveals the level of godliness which is naturally hidden. Shalamayla mayla, which is higher, b'chinas ha'ara, from a trace of godly light. Shebeiridus ha'madegis, which is ascent through the steps. V'seider ha'ishtalshus, nor v'ishtalshus, ma'amud is gal, in the revealed world, which is peripheral, superficial, which is based on proof and understanding rather than enlightenment and faith. And at Matan Torah, that's what we got. This chokhmah. Key 150. When it comes to Yiddishkeit, it says in the pasuk in B'chukais. Now I don't normally do this because when classes air are not necessarily in concert with when classes are given. It happens to be this week Pashas B'chukais Tavshinai Tes. So it's B'hashgacha that we're learning the shtickle maimer. And it says in B'chukais Telechu, and of course Rashi says Shetihi yu amelim b'teira, that in B'chukais Telechu means to learn Teira, because the Shmartem Tishmeru Vasisam Esim goes out of mitzvahs Amur. So in B'chukei Telecha goes on the line of Limud HaTeira, and of course my mother asked the question that if B'chukei means Limud HaTeira, why use the word B'chukei and not in B'teirei Telecha? And the answer is this: B'chukei is a remes of B'chines Eisies Shavechakika, the level of Teira which is carved. The level of Teira which is carved means how you and God are one, not how you and God understand each other. Inside the nefesh that exists, in our subconscious it's real. And if we would afford ourselves, if we permit ourselves to let this emerge and not burden ourselves with this need for physical proof, we'd be much closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And he explains, line 151, even though Torah is in physical things. At the same time, Eidin say Baruch Hu ba'atzmei, godless, on a level of etzem, as is in relationship with himself, as Meluba Shem is revealed through them. Now, Rabbi said, I don't have time to be ma'idich, but this I want to tell you, that usually when you use the word Islapshus and Kalim, it goes on Tzimtzum. Here we're using the word Islapshus and Tzimtzum, Kalim, and going on Etzem. How the Etzem of Elikus is available through the Eisias HaTeira, if it's Eisias HaChakika, where you and the Eisias are one. For example, the soul and the body. And of course the ability in the neshama, which to see, which starts out in the brain, is revealed in the eye. And the power to hear Gashmi comes down to the physical ear. That our eyes and our ears. Even though they're physical, nasim kelim, they become vessels and vehicles for ruchnias. That through the physical eye, through the physical ear, we should have riyah and shmir, to see and to hear. What the Rebbe is clearly trying to say, not what you would assume he's trying to say, that by the neshama's manifesting and tzimtzing itself to come into the physical eye, we're able to see physically. And the neshama is manifesting and tzimtzing itself in the physical, able to hear, but to the contrary, how somehow, in one way, the neshama's essence is in the seeing and hearing. Kach, similarly, ha-teira va-mitzvah b'chinas kelim leidin say baruch hu, teira mitzvahs are a vessel for the essence of godliness. Ha-malubish behem, which is revealed through them, shebehem va-yadim as galin say baruch hu, begilim mamish, it reveals the essence of godliness. Not giluyim, but it's, and that's today's shir. That Shavuos is chita. And what is chita? The ability to intuit, to be vowed HaKadosh Baruch Hu in a way which is beyond the heaviness of the mind and proof and logic, which makes the connection to Hashem be in a way of chakika. You and God are one. And accordingly, the life that you live reflects that intimacy, that depth, that integrity.